episode, we will be talking about the 1900s through the 1920s and how these were the most influential decades because of its writers, events, and key figures. Let's first talk about the authors.
W.E.B. Du Bois wrote many types of literature. One of his most famous writings were The Souls of Black Folk, that is known as one of the most important literature for African American history and sociology. In his book, he talks about two very important terms, double consciousness and the veil. The double consciousness is talking about how African Americans have two identities, their American identity and their African American identity. Du Bois explains that they have their American identity because they are descendants from slaves. The veil is an example of the barrier between blacks and whites. The veil resembles how even when white people try to understand the experience that African Americans went through, they will never fully understand their experience.
Upton Sinclair rose to prominence in the 1900s to 1920s. He wrote almost 100 books during his lifetime. His work reached its peak in the early 1920s, and he won the Pulitzer Prize in 1943 for fiction. The Jungle is one of Sinclair's most controversial yet thought-provoking novels. It allows its readers to understand the sanitary and labor conditions in regards to the United States meatpacking industry. This novel created many problems but luckily led to the Pure Food and Drug Act being passed as well as the Meat Act. Much like The Jungle, a variety of his other books addresses societal issues, for example, yellow journalism and The Brass Check, which is another one of his stories. Sinclair will not be forgotten due to his bravery in writing and his stance in political and societal issues due to the fact he was a muckraker.
Ida Tarbell was a very influential writer and journalist during the early 1900s. Similar to Sinclair, she was a yellow journalist and muckraker. Tarbell sought for social reform. One of her most well-known works is her book, The History of Standard Oil, which exposed the corruption of businesses at the time. Also, this book revealed the issues with monopolies, especially with the wealthy John D. Rockefeller and his oil company. For example, in her book, Tarbell says, Rockefeller and his company fought their way to control through bribe and blackmail. Ida in her book brought attention to the issue of large companies, which in the end helped the Supreme Court make their decision to break up monopolies through the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. This act called for the regulation of big businesses as well as prevented the occurrence of future monopolies.
20th century author, poet, philosopher, and matriarch of the lost generation, Gertrude Stein defied the conventional tactics of American writing by rejecting the use of punctuation. Her style grew in popularity following World War I, where she furthered the idea of writing about the emotional self rather than a structural narrative form, thus furthering her beliefs that literature should, quote, consist of an exact reproduction of either an outer or an inner reality, influencing the new writers emerging from World War I, known as the lost generation. The emotional self ideals are expressed in Stein's poem Sacred Emily, where the famous line, "A rose is a rose is a rose is a rose," is communicated. The literal meaning of this sentence is that a rose is a rose no matter what. However, the philosophical meaning, a rose can be interpreted as a name, event, or situation, further demonstrating how things are as they are.
Robert Frost was born on March 26, 1874, in San Francisco, California. The farm that his family lived on in Massachusetts affected Frost for his growing interest in poetry. Frost liked the isolation of the farm, and this isolation influenced his poetry, which is similar to the situation of Emily Dickinson. One of Frost's most famous works is Out, Out, a story of a boy who slices his hand off while cutting wood. The message of this work is that work has to be done, but it is also pointless because work is for survival, and survival eventually fails. It reflects the grim feelings during World War I, which are also reflected in the works of the lost generation. This is why Frost's poems are seen as the bridge between 19th century and 20th century poetry.
Now we will talk about some major events that happened during this time, like World War I, immigration, the Progressive Era, the changes in literature, and the lost generation. Let's take a look back and go more into detail about these events.
A very influential event during the 1900s to 1920s was World War I. During and after World War I, American factories thrived because they were producing many wartime products, and after the war, there were plenty of consumer products. The U.S. became one of the world's industrial leaders, which resulted in the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties were a time when the nation's wealth doubled, and it was the beginning of consumer demand. As a result of World War I was the first Red Scare. It emerged after the rise of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union became communist, many Americans were fearful of the Soviets attacking the U.S. Americans during this time attempted to capture communists in the U.S.
It is no surprise that immigration was a major problem in the early 1900s. Though people would come to America for a better life, that was not always what they would receive. Once again, Sinclair's novel The Jungle depicts the struggles with United States immigration. Published in 1906, it was put into public eye during the Progressive Era. Sinclair says, "In the country, rich or poor, a man was free. He might do as he pleased, and count himself as good as any other man. So America was a place of which lovers and young people dreamed. If only one could manage to get the price of passage, he could count his troubles at an end." This quote means that though America was a land of opportunity, the price at which one had to pay was not always worth it. Immigration in 1910 was difficult and not guaranteed. Thousands would land in the island each day, but only some were lucky enough to walk further than the island.
Next up is the Progressive Era, which occurred between the end of the 1800s until 1920. This era was created in response to a variety of economic and social issues that were occurring throughout the U.S. due to the new fast-paced industrialization. Progressivists challenged society and believed that the less fortunate had the chance to change if they had access to education and a safe environment. They challenged the belief of social Darwinism, which was survival of the fittest. This era was the beginning of many social and economic reforms that were to follow in later decades.
As previously mentioned, World War I was a major event that impacted both the people and the society. Most notably are the members of the Lost Generation, a group of writers that emerged from the war. The ex-patriotic writers of the Lost Generation moved to the European nations to escape tradition, where they were influenced by literary cultures of popular cities, such as London and Paris. This movement changed the cause of American literature as their social mores gave rise to the Roaring Twenties, with its mention of gangsters, speakeasies, and hedonism. Fitzgerald, for example, delved into this feeling of futility and the spirit of the Jazz Age. E. Cummings pushed the boundaries of form by playing with spelling and syntax, thus creating new techniques and structure for his literature.
During the first 2 decades of the 1900s, there was a change in writing style. Before the 1900s, poetry was seen as a specific kind of writing that required a template such as rhyme scheme. At the turn of the 20th century, a style of writing was quite popular, blank verse. Blank verse still follows a pattern, a meter, but has no general rhyme scheme. Many poets began to write poetry in free verse, which means no rhyme scheme or meter. These works were not appreciated by the public before World War I, but during and after the war, it became an accepted method.
Finally, we will talk about some very influential individuals during this time, like J.P. Morgan, Thomas Edison, Booker T. Washington, Babe Ruth, and Teddy Roosevelt.
Booker T. Washington was a major influence in the 1900s to 1920s. Washington advocated for black rights, similar to W.E.B. Du Bois. Washington was the founder of the National Negro Business League, and after 20 years, he was the advisor for President Roosevelt and Taft. Washington advocated for African Americans to have more economic freedom. Since Washington grew up a slave, he encouraged African Americans to get a job and start getting income, and over time, they will grow on the economic ladder. Washington hoped that African Americans will eventually be equal economically to the white race.
Another important person to know is Thomas Edison. Most recognize him for being the inventor of the light bulb, a device billions of people use daily. He was not only an inventor, but also a businessman. Besides the light bulb, he made the phonograph and motion picture camera. With the motion picture camera, the concept of American leisure changed a lot. The amount of families going to the cinema increased vastly, and movies themselves influenced a majority of society. They depicted not only entertaining stories, but stories with meaning behind them. For example, World War I films and wartime propaganda. We owe this change to Edison.
One crucial figure from this time period is Theodore Roosevelt, better known as Teddy. He took a stance on social and economic issues and worked to create a balance between the rich and the poor. During his presidency, he worked diligently to get rid of monopolies. Not only did Teddy want reform, he also wanted to change the environment. He was a conservationist and was the first president to advocate laws and regulations regarding the earth. Teddy is known for being an active and vital member in the progressive movement.
One of the most powerful businessmen and bankers of this period is J.P. Morgan, who played a key role as he financed the buildings of railroads and helped organize U.S. Steel, General Electric, and many other major companies that ruled over the U.S. economy. Morgan was an influential man during this period, as his successful endeavors led to him to stabilize the American financial market during several economic crises, including the Panic of 1907.
Babe Ruth was an influential figure by the end of the 1910s. He is known as the first sports superstar. He caused a revival of sports in America after World War I. Bringing back baseball into American life was part of a trend in which America was turning inwards and focusing on itself rather than other places in the world. Although Babe Ruth had nothing to do with the isolationist movement, he symbolized a desire in America to be joyful and peaceful.